Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the program Legal Ops and Organizational Change, Practical Examples in How to Succeed, presented by ACC Northeast and Seyfarth Shaw. All participants are in listen-only mode. You're encouraged to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature on WebEx. However, if your question is not answered, our presenters will follow up directly with you in the coming days. For those of you interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down. It will not be repeated, and it is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar, recording, and materials will be distributed to attendees following the presentation. Now, to introduce our presenters for today's program, Whitney Woodard, Ben Hayden, and Rachel DiGiacomo. Whitney Woodard is a legal project manager at Seyfarth Shaw, so with over 11 years of project management experience, including 5 years in the legal sector. She focuses on improving processes and supporting client-facing teams in managing complex legal projects. Ben Hayden is currently Vice President for Legal Operations at Cengage Group, a global education technology company. Prior to joining Cengage Group, Ben worked in legal operations at a Fortune 15 company and in pricing and project management roles at an AmLaw 20 law firm. Rachel DiGiacomo is a Senior Manager of Contract Management at Cengage Group. In her current role, Rachel focuses on contracting processes, lifecycle management, process transformation, and efficiency efforts. She currently manages a team of 8 offshore resources who are focused on contracting for the broader organization, and she herself is in the midst of a large change management effort for her department. Our program today aims to build off past ACC Northeast programs that we've done on the topics of legal ops and change management. Now, these past sessions, which you can still find on our website, have really focused on strategies and theories. So today we wanted to lean into the practical with some real-world examples that our presenters have experienced in their roles and highlight some potential challenges in those experiences and the ways they've been able to successfully implement these organizational changes. We have 5 examples we're going to go through on today's program. But first, to kick us off, Whitney is going to take us through a brief overview of Change Management 101. Whitney?
Great. Thanks, Ben. So let's just kick this off with a bit of a reality check. And I'm sure as in-house counsel that you've probably experienced firsthand just how complex and disruptive change can actually be, whether that's adapting to those new regulations or implementing some new legal technologies or handling some internal organizational shifts. Navigating those changes effectively is crucial, and that's really where change management comes in. So we're just going to kind of go through what exactly is change management, right? Think of change management as your strategic playbook for handling change. It's really all about addressing the human side of that transition and helping everyone on your legal teams all the way to entire departments within your organizations adjust smoothly to those new processes, systems, or structures. It's also about utilizing the processes, tools, and different techniques. This is just basically to make change a little less overwhelming for everyone involved. These types of techniques, tools, processes can include everything from detailed planning and clear communication to hands-on support. Regardless, all of it is aimed at making the transition as seamless as possible. And the goal of change management is simple, but it's really powerful, and that's really to achieve and maintain a desired business outcome. It's really all about ensuring that not only does the change take place, but that it also delivers those long-term benefits and improvements that we're seeking. And then lastly, there's a lot of established methodologies and frameworks and different policies and key things to think about, as Andy just kind of went through earlier, that we covered that last year. But even with all of that out there, it's really just about choosing what fits best for your organization or your department and the change that you're trying to implement. Next slide, please. So as I previously mentioned, there's a lot of frameworks, principles, methodologies to consider regarding change management. But today, we're just going to focus on these three, and these ones can significantly impact how you can implement change within your organizations and departments. The first one we're going to cover is creating buy-in, which is crucial to engage and gain that support from everyone who's going to be affected by that change, and doing that early on. Next, we're going to cover communication and communicating early and often. So that regular, transparent communication, which would just help to manage expectations and keep everybody informed throughout that process. And then lastly, we're going to cover locking in that change. To make that change stick, it's just really important to reinforce those new behaviors and practices so that you can ensure that they become a permanent part of your organization structure. So let's briefly just explore the first one. So creating the buy-in. Here's how you're just going to ensure that you can gain the support that's needed, especially in the context of in-house legal teams within businesses of all sizes. So first, we're going to want to identify those key stakeholders. And within this, there's two different components here. So we want to identify those key stakeholders on the leadership team, but then also some of those influential team members. So sticking with the leadership team for a second, we want to make sure that those key individuals and leadership, that they are presenting that united front and they're really aligned and they're aligning others with the change. We want to make sure that those key individuals on the leadership team are all in agreement and that they're consistently communicating that change to everyone else on that team. And for the influential team members, I kind of like to call them our change champions. And these are individuals who are a little deeper within the organization and the ones who are actually going to be affected by the change. So they kind of serve as your frontline kind of change support and making sure everybody else on the team is also getting bought into the change itself. You're going to want to delegate and assign some specific responsibilities for implementing the change to individuals within that organization. And you want to involve them in identifying those problems and developing solutions to really foster a sense of ownership. And we'll kind of see a little example of this in my example that I'll present a little later regarding the AI implementation. Next, you're really going to want to understand the culture and work within that culture. So those existing values and attitudes within the organization. And with that, you're going to want to customize your communication and any type of training to fit that cultural context. And just so you can ensure that those different messages really resonate with your team. And then lastly, you're going to want to deal with resistance. So as we know, there's usually a lot of resistance when it comes to change, because change just, it's not fun. But if you deal with that resistance and you really lean into it, it's best to just engage with those who might have some resistance to the change and really understand what their concerns are so you can collaboratively address those different concerns. Next.
Whitney, I'd love to jump in here real quick. I think that to me, that third bullet, understanding culture and working with it, I think, in my opinion, that's really one of the most important pieces here. I think it's really important that we're really honest with ourselves about our own organizational culture. Are we top down? Are we, making decision by committee? So for us at Cengage Group, we're super collaborative, and we have what I call sort of like a flat organization where sort of everybody is empowered to see something, make a change, and take ownership of it. It's really great, again, from an accountability perspective, but can create challenges when you're trying to implement sort of broad scale change. So I think knowing and really acknowledging organizational culture means that you can sort of adapt your approach to fit the way things work in your own organization, which I think will definitely increase the likelihood of success of whatever it is that you're trying to make happen.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. Okay, and so the next thing we want to talk about here is communication, and we stress early and often as both key components to ensuring that your communication is really effective. And here's really how you're going to approach that. So first, we want to create that communication plan. And within that, we want to have some type of communication strategy. And we want to define how the organization will communicate the change and what methods will be used to keep everyone informed. And along with that, we also want to understand what channel we're going to use. So are we an organization that's email heavy, meeting heavy? Is there an internet available that we can just upload updates there? And then lastly, we want to think about who's going to be responsible for delivering these communications. And it's really important that there's clear roles and helping to ensure that consistent messaging so that it's coming from one place. That is really important here. And with that communication, this is more so pointed at leadership, but you want to properly translate that vision. It's super important for everyone to understand how the new processes and roles will affect their day-to-day responsibilities and then just contribute to the overall goal of the organization. So that's really more leaning heavy on leadership, but you want to make sure that you're consistently and continuously translating that vision to the team. And then you want to acknowledge that change is going to affect everyone a little differently, right? So the people who are handling the day-to-day operations, it's going to affect them differently than it is those in leadership. So we want to acknowledge that. And if we acknowledge that, we can then tailor our communications so that they address those diverse needs and concerns. And then lastly, with our communication, in order to reinforce these changes, we're going to want to continuously remind all stakeholders at all levels the reasons for this change and the benefits that it's going to bring to the organization and to their day-to-day. We also want to highlight exactly how it's going to positively impact them and the organization. So by communicating early and often, we just ensure that clarity, we reduce uncertainty, and just foster an overall smoother transition. Okay, and then the last principle that we're just going to highlight for today is locking in that change and making sure those new practices you've implemented really become a permanent part of your organization. So the first step to that is just integrating and embedding those new practices into your standard procedures. This can be done in a lot of different ways. I'll kind of talk about a little later where we specifically use process mapping to really identify and detail out and embed those new changes into our day-to-day processes. But there's different ways that can be done. Next, you're going to want to track the impact of those changes using some type of performance metrics. So regularly monitoring just really helps you assess how well the changes are working, and then also being able to identify whether or not any changes are needed. And then finally, my favorite one, celebrating the achievements that come with a successful change and the change implementation. Recognizing those milestones and providing ongoing support just really reinforces those positive aspects of the change, and it keeps the momentum for the team. So just to kind of illustrate all of these concepts at play in some real world scenarios, we're going to go ahead and move into our first practical example, and then take us away.
Thank you very much. As my team knows, I sometimes get a little wordy, so I'm going to time myself here to make sure that I'm not going over a lot of time here because I don't want to hog all our airtime. But so just real quick, I've been with Cengage Group for about 7 years, and I've been working with Rachel for I think about 2.5. And so over this time, we've done a ton of stuff, a ton of projects, big, small. And so what we've tried to do is pick some examples here from our own experience that really highlight the role that that change management has played in those projects. And so the first example that I'm going to start with is the creation of our centralized request and intake platform for our legal department. And this is something that our legal ops team worked on for several years. So our starting state really was like, I think a lot of departments where we were super fractured, really siloed in terms of how requests were coming, inbound requests were coming into the department. In general, everything was happening via email to individual folks on the team. So what we did was, starting in August of 2021, I think, we stood up what we call the Legal Central Intake. And essentially, it's a homegrown legal sort of request and intake platform that we built in a tool called Smartsheet. And we started with contract operations requests and independent contractor agreement requests. 3 years later, we've got all commercial and contract related requests originating in the intake, in addition to privacy, compliance, general questions, all going through what we call the LCI. We've got, I think, really, really good saturation and kind of brand recognition across the organization. People know what the LCI is, and they know that they're supposed to use it when they need most things from our legal team. And we've actually had over 20,000 requests through that intake since 2020, since it was stood up in 2021. So a pretty good, I'd say pretty good change management effort kind of went into getting it to where it is today. But let's go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we experienced trying to stand this up. So I think the biggest pitfall that I would caution folks when they're sort of undertaking a project like this is really going around the system and creating special exceptions. So people, stakeholders getting used to, well, I always go to this person, and instead of using the intake, still going right to that person via email. And not sort of correcting that behavior when it happens. That's a really, really big one that goes, into setting up an intake platform like this, because it's just kind of muscle memory for people. We're used to working how we work, and we're used to using the same avenues that we've always used to get our questions answered and get things done. The second thing that was really could have been a major issue for us is sort of this concept of just operating in an echo chamber, right? Where we are, we as the legal ops team, the legal ops team setting up in the background this intake platform and doing it in sort of a vacuum without taking into account input from our stakeholders and also the people that are actually going to be doing the work. So I think really important to consider sort of two things here. So the effort that's really required of the requester, and balancing that with the information that the person on the other end of this, the person that's actually going to be actioning the request, what they're going to need. Because too little information and the person actioning the request not going to have what they need to do to action the request. And too much information, you're going to overburden the requester, and they're not going to want to do it. They're not going to want to interact with your intake platform, which is really going to hamper that sort of concept of buy-in that we had talked about, that Whitney had talked about at the beginning of the session here. And I think I'm going to skip around here a little bit, but one of the big things for us in particular, when we stood up this platform on our end, was really this perception of the legal black hole, right? So I'm a requester, and I'm really used to emailing Jane Doe, for this type of request, and now you're telling me that, hey, I've got to sort of put my information into a form, and then it's going to sort of go into some shoebox somewhere, and that fear of loss of those personal relationships. So that's something we really took into account when we were setting up this platform. So let's skip to the next slide and talk about some ways to really make a project like this succeed. So, not to sound like a broken record, but we're going to be, this first point here is going to be a thread throughout all of the examples that we talk about today, but really clear communication about the benefits. It's something that Whitney was talking about in terms of creating that buy-in, really, and properly translating the vision of the change, whatever it might be. Really important to sort of put those benefits in the context of the people that are going to be actually interacting with whatever it is. In this case, the requesters that are going to be interacting with our intake platform. It's not really enough to say, well, it's going to make things really easy for legal, right? It's going to make things easier for legal. That's great for getting folks on my team to sort of embrace a change like this, but it doesn't really resonate in the same way for example, a sales organization. So being really clear about why this is a good thing for the people that are going to have to interact with it is I think top for my number one suggestion for success for something like this. The second being really ensuring a united front. So again, that's avoiding the, well, you can just email me directly, that's fine. Or not being clear about who's on point for certain things that come in from the intake platform. Really sort of establishing those roles and responsibilities and accountability, not just on the part of who's doing the work once it comes in, but also what we expect of our stakeholders interacting with the platform. That's really, really important. And then the sort of, if we're talking top three, the third thing that I think has been really important for us in our implementation of this platform is really this concept of just trying to take it slow and iterating versus attempting to go 100% right out of the gate and have something fully baked. So if you recall in the first slide on this topic, I had said that we started out with contract operations requests and independent contractor agreement requests. And that was really, that was an intentional decision. We wanted to sort of almost use those two request types as a pilot of sorts so that we could see how the organization would react to needing to use an intake platform like this. And it allowed us to take two request types that are important, but that are somewhat less complex than maybe some of the other request types that we eventually built into the intake platform, and really use them to see, okay, how do we, are we really getting that buy-in? Do people seem to be having trouble with certain questions that we're asking on the front end? And that was really helpful to kind of take it slow, start with little pieces, learn from those little pieces, and then expand out from there. I think if we had tried to do it, if we had tried to go, all the way 100% with every request in the legal department, we would probably not have. I think the initiative would have failed. Because it would have been too much all at once, and too much change is really not ever a good thing. Okay, so I know I only went through the top three. In the interest of time, I'm gonna stop there. I think we are gonna distribute this deck after. So just because I didn't go over the other three doesn't mean that that information is not going to be available to folks. So I think time to jump to our second example, which is Rachel.
Thanks, Ben. So I think outsourcing in general, outsourcing low-touch work is probably a topic that isn't spoken about too often when it comes to change management, because it's not the easiest conversation to have. It's certainly not an easy change to make, and it is complex. We're talking about making sure you keep the human in change management. I feel like this is probably the largest example of how important that is. So on the slide here, I won't go through every detail for you, but you'll see the history of the legal team's outsourcing project at Cengage over the course of the past year. Last summer, our entire organization entered into a long-term project with the goal of reducing costs, streamlining our processes, reducing complexities, the standard corporate efforts. We worked with a consulting company to facilitate that, to make that happen. And our efforts with them resulted in us identifying about 25% of our, albeit small to begin with, legal teams' roles as eligible for outsourcing. That work was the contract-based work primarily, the drafting, the review, and the administrative pieces of contracting also. So fast forward a year through a lot of intensive prep work, multiple parts of our team, a pilot with that vendor who's going to be doing the outsourcing for us, knowledge transfer and training from the outgoing team members to the new team members, with that outsourcing vendor, and we're arriving where we are today, where we have our group of offshore resources from this vendor who are working today as an integral part of our legal team, just as the former members did on that contracting work. So that in and of itself was an enormous change. Not to mention, it changed the whole operating model of the legal team. What started out as segmented pieces of the team who would work primarily with their own business units and be that point of contact for a business unit within the organization, and only had a limited set of tasks to do in relation to contracts. Now, all 8 team members know how to do everyone else's job within that team of 8. So there's a lot of cross training, but while that's great for, efficiency, scalability, not putting too much work on any one particular person, it's also completely changed our processes. So that change has created more work for the change management concept as well. Next slide, please. And I'll also stick to the highlights here. So like I said, this is a pretty complex topic, and we're very much still in it today. I think what would have derailed us to like the most difficult place to pull ourselves out of here would have been the setting of unrealistic or unmanageable expectations as we went through this effort. If we had tried to depersonalize the process or not acknowledge the human aspects of it, and underestimating the amount of work that was needed. The expectations and the importance of those are, I think, probably true for any change management process. But with this, it really was, like I said, a change to how we worked, how we would interact with stakeholders across the organization. It was a lot and is a lot of process change. A lot of different ways to interact. The quality of work may change. And we needed to be as transparent as we could be and as fair as we could be about what this would really look like. We were never comfortable saying, there will never be a disruption, that everything will run completely smoothly, and we've prepared for every single inevitability. It's just, you're setting yourself up to fail in that instance. And you have to hope that, people will empathize with the situation and they'll work with you as your coworkers. Again, the human aspect of this was tremendous. Our friends and colleagues left, and we got new friends and colleagues with the new resources, with our new team members. So pretending like that wasn't relevant and that wasn't a factor was not something that we did, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it. As much as AI is a part of our conversations, can't ignore the fact that this is a human experience here, and that factors into all the choices that we make when it comes to outsourcing work. And underestimating the amount of work needed also would have had the same issues as if we had set unrealistic expectations. It wasn't just work transferring the knowledge, training 8 new people. It was so much more than that. Again, trying to think of all the inevitabilities and trying to account for them takes so much time and effort, and you'll never cover everything. So leaving room for missteps, leaving room for failures, I think is going to set you up for success. Happy that we've had our fair share of both, and we've definitely learned from both those successes and failures at the moment. We'll continue to. Next slide, please. Again, for the sake of transparency, this is still an ongoing effort for us at Cengage, for Ben and I. So to say how to succeed would mean, leaving out the elephant in the room that we haven't gotten to a natural success point yet. We're still in it. So again, sharing here what we have been successful at and what we've learned from our failures. moving ahead at good enough was something that we definitely worked through. It was difficult for me as somebody who wants to be fully prepared before I move ahead. And luckily had, thoughtful leadership to say, you've prepared enough, like, let's not undermine the efforts by trying to make it perfect. Keeping flexible and being able to adapt was great. Executing with empathy is reaching back to that human point. If we had just ignored it, if we ignored the human aspects, it would have been adding to our problems. And I think that, again, the maintaining the flexibility and the adaptability was great in terms of pushing us ahead. Being able to take a breath and say, we haven't done this before, so we're going to try. It might be wrong, it might be right, it might be wrong, but leaving room to adapt instead of looking for a playbook that doesn't exist on how to make it work has allowed us to succeed so far.
Rach, I'm gonna, I know you're gonna, this was not one of the ones that you planned on talking about, but the last bullet here, I think is, to me, really important from sort of an integration perspective. And it also ties into what Whitney was talking about at the top of the hour about the cultural aspect to change management and sort of understanding, being honest with yourself about the culture with which you're operating inside your organization. So, for for us, it was and is really critical for the outsourced team to feel like a natural extension of the core Cengage team. That's just how we have to operate to be successful in our organization, I think. And we're still working on how to figure out how to make that happen. But I think a big advantage is that we are aligned with our vendor in terms of how the extended team should operate and should interact with us. We know that we want them to be a part of our town halls. We know that they should have direct access to business requesters when it makes sense. We know that we need them to have access to Slack, just like a real employee at Cengage Group. And I think if our vendor had a different approach, it would have made this change, just that much more difficult. It's already super difficult for our team and for the broader organization. It just would have been that much harder because of that misalignment. So I think that last point is really important.
Thanks, Ben. I think you are our next slide owner as well.
I am. I'm up again. Okay. All right. So the second example that I wanted to talk folks through. So standing up self-serve resources. So what we have done, I guess it was about a year ago, was create some self-serve resources for our RFP and our bid support needs for our sales team. So we can go, there we go. So our sort of problem statement was, we as an organization, in some business units more than others, really lack centralized bid support or sales enablement teams in certain business units, which was creating really an additional burden on us in legal. So we were getting, repetitive questions from folks that were working on RFPs and bids. Who can sign this? Where do I go for this info? And because legal was the consistent player in most sales RFPs, 99% of the time we were asked to sort of, hey, can you review these RFP documents? We became the place where everybody would come to ask these questions, even if they weren't technically legal, or even if we've answered them, dozens of times in the past. We had no repository for corporate or company profile information, which created another bottleneck. Especially for our corporate counsel, because he's sort of the keeper of things like, became, I guess, the de facto keeper of things like, what's the legal name for the company, or what's the date of our incorporation, or can you give me a W-9? And for me and for Rachel and all of our legal ops team, as legal ops people, having your corporate counsel have to take time out of his day to answer those type of questions is not sort of in line with our with our efficiency model and having the right resource doing the right kind of work. So really there was just a general lack of clarity around where to get information, what legal was responsible for, and what the business units were responsible for within the context of RFPs and bids. So what we did was create really a collection of what I'll call living resources that are self-serve, so that the sales and bid teams can really go to grab the information that they need on their own. So again, relied heavily on Smartsheet. We created a database of corporate information, things like I talked about just a second ago, date of incorporation, legal name, notice address, things like that. We created a enterprise who to call list. So if you need information on insurance coverage, you go to our treasury team, and things like that. A repository of forms that the BUs don't need to come to legal to get approval for, that they can say, oh, this form's on the list, I can just go ahead and sign it. We had clear guidelines on accountability, who is responsible for what is the business owned versus legal. And then something really important was expectations around turnaround times. Because we wanted to be really clear that, you're sending over a zip file with 15 attachments. We're not gonna be able to turn that around for you in 24 hours. It's just not possible. So wanted to be really clear about expectations there. Okay, let's move to the next slide. We'll talk about pitfalls a little bit. In setting up self-serve resources in general, regardless of the type of resources, I think that the biggest thing to watch out for really is that, again, that resistance to change and overcoming that muscle memory. So, you've got requesters that are just, again, like the example I gave with the intake platform, just used to going to somebody. In this example, going to Brian, our corporate counsel, to get some of this information, really needing to kind of get folks over that hump and pointing them to those resources. And I think really important here is getting your own, in our case, getting legal team members to really overcome that muscle memory as well. That just because someone came to you and wants this information, you're not going to be unhelpful if you're pointing them to the place where they can get it themselves instead of actually giving them the answer. And that was really tough for us because we are such a collaborative team, and everyone really does want to help, even if it's not technically, that question's not technically their job. So getting to that point where people felt comfortable saying, hey, totally get it, but actually we have a SharePoint site that you can go to, that was really, really important. Second, don't overdo it. We have absolutely fallen into this trap in terms of putting everything up on SharePoint, which creates just sort of a web of great information, but becomes really difficult to find, and really can overwhelm end users in a way that was, completely unintentionally, right? Like you're putting these resources online with the goal of trying to simplify, and it really actually has the opposite effect. And then the third one I'll just touch on really quickly is potential for misuse of the self-serve materials. So really important that the folks, the audience for these materials understands, what the thing is and when they're supposed to use it. Because, and this actually kind of applies to the second to last bullet here also, if something is too complex or someone doesn't know exactly what they're looking at or thinks they do but don't, they may end up sort of applying those resources in ways that was not intended. So big pitfall there, making sure that folks actually understand what the intended purpose is for those resources. Okay, let's go to the next slide, how to succeed. Okay, so I'm going to just touch on the three, what I think are the three biggest ones here. So far and away, the biggest one is if you're going to put stuff in a self-serve platform, the biggest thing is making sure those resources stay up to date. Because as soon as someone goes somewhere and pulls a template and then gets told, a couple days later that template was updated a couple months ago. You're using an old template. They're never going to go to that resource again, and you've lost a customer. So really important to make sure whatever you put up from a self-serve perspective gets kept up to date. And for us, making sure that there's accountability on who actually has responsibility for keeping that stuff up to date is super important. Second, to me, really important is really, again, driving home the point that I made on the last slide, which is remaining consistent when directing stakeholders to use those resources. So even though they're coming to you and they may be super resistant to the self-serve model, it's really important just not to give in and just keep kind of reiterating like, oh, we've got to share, in our case, we've got a SharePoint site for that. Here you go. We've got it. We set up a smart sheet for that information. Here it is. Super important to keep kind of keep that unified front and make sure that folks are being consistent in the messaging that they're giving. And then the third most important to me really is communication on the benefits, right? This ties right back to Whitney's intro around communication. Making sure that the folks that are going to be impacted by the change, in this case, impacted by being directed to self-service resources, make sure that they can see a direct impact to the way that they work. So, hey, I know you're used to emailing me to get this information, but actually, if you use this SharePoint that we set up for you, you don't have to wait for me to respond. It's just going to be much faster. So in that way, you're sort of contextualizing the resources that you've created in a way that is showing their benefit to the folks that are actually the people that are the resources were built for. And then I guess the last, I know I said three, but I'll just sneak in a fourth here. This is important, I think, for this example, for the example Rachel gave, for the example I gave at the top, and for the example Whitney's going to give, is really just making sure there's avenues for questions and for concerns so that people understand who they can go to have an actual human, right, to go to for questions or concerns. I think that's really important and gives people a sense of comfort and a little bit of empowerment to say like, okay, like I've got these resources. I think I'm pretty good. I know kind of what I need, but I know that if I do have a question, I've got support. I know who to turn to if I need to ask a question. And for us, that's been I think really key in getting folks to just kind of be a little brave and try to use some of the self-service resources on their own, knowing that they have a team of folks that are happy to back them up if they do have questions.
Hey, Ben, really quickly too, on your point about updating those resources and keeping them current. In your instance, did you also come up with like a specific cadence for that and kind of communicate that cadence to the end users so that they kind of knew specifically when resources would be updated on a regular basis?
So for this example, yes. So I think that a really great example on this example is the SharePoint that I meant, or the smart sheet I mentioned that has those corporate information. So the W-9 gets updated by our finance team on a yearly basis, and there are links to our quarterly filings that we host on our website that we periodically have to make sure that those links are still pointing to the right place. And so we established a cadence of 6 months for certain of those resources, and then 12 months for everything else. For us, we haven't sort of publicized that fact to the users. I think to them, they come and it's always, the information appears always to be updated. So it's kind of happening behind the scenes. But certainly for, I think, other types of resources, making sure that folks understand the cadence with which or on which whatever it is going to be reviewed and updated, I think could be really important and useful. So folks know and are reassured that they're always getting the latest and greatest, and the stuff is that they're relying on is going to be up to date.
Right. No.
All right, I think, Rach, we're going back to you.
Yep. As I'm looking at this, I'm realizing this is another topic that's probably not the traditional change management practical application conversation. It's going back to, this one applies to everything. This has its hands in every single aspect of change management, because what you're changing involves the team and involves these people. And realistically, legal hasn't always been known as having the best culture historically. We're not known for having the healthiest culture or the best work-life balance, but always room for improvement. And I think, well, if you're on this call, you're already wanting to improve upon those things. And overall, if you have a great team culture and great dynamics to start out with, any change that you make can definitely impact that. And that team culture and those dynamics might not just automatically recover and go back to the way they were. Sometimes they'll change for the better, sometimes for the worse. And they might need, intervention. The quote here at the top, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, from management consultant and writer Peter Drucker, is what launched this thought for me. That, again, your strategy, your changes, no matter how fantastic, no matter how much time you spent putting into them, it's the culture that is your access point for success and failure for most changes. In my opinion, at least, it's a very big factor in the success or failure. And as I was writing these points too, and Ben and I were talking about them, and I'm looking at the words prioritizing wants over needs and interest and values. And the time I realized I was calling on concepts that weren't originally my own. They were from a book called Getting to Yes by Fisher and Ury. If you've taken as many dispute resolution and negotiation classes as I have, that title might make you cringe, might make you smile, but either way, you'll probably recognize it. And it ended up being what was woven through my thought process here when it came to addressing the people piece of change management and the culture. On the left side is the action, right side is more of the result. The quantity over quality as a success indicator will definitely impact your culture, whether it's volume-based success or it's quality-based success. That definitely moves the needle one way or the other. If you are choosing quantity over quality as success, and you want to move towards, slowing it down and creating intentionality and building partnerships, that's a huge part of team culture, and that will in and of itself change the way your whole team works, with how they operate, how they work with one another, how they interact with stakeholders. It's a difference between just trying to get this request done because you want it off your desk, or devoting some time to ask why that person's asking you that question and opening up a potential can of worms and maybe even more work for yourself if the answer you get is not what you expected. But that's the intentionality, and that's the building partnerships and relationships with your stakeholders. And again, we're breaking chains here by talking about, the traditional stereotypes of legal and how we want them to improve. Legal is often seen as the office of no. We're the ones who say no to the fun things that everybody else wants to do. And sometimes we can overcorrect for that and say yes to everything, so that we're not seen as the culture of no, that we do want everyone to come to us. And we know the more we say no, the less likely people are to adhere to our processes, to come and speak to us before they start a new initiative. And if we within the legal team balance the business interests and our interests, and we acknowledge that, sales job and their interest is to make money, and legal's job is to eventually keep the doors open so that sales can make money. If we can work in a partnership of that way, as opposed to, no, I'm right, no, I'm bigger and better than you, that's definitely a dynamic that in and of itself can create a culture either way. And prioritizing stakeholder wants over needs, again, that goes back to, I think, the quantity over quality. If you hear what someone has to say and you recognize what's not being said, you're more likely to get a better result because you're discovering again the motivation, the root cause. When sales says, I need this contract reviewed today, you can say, okay, I will drop what I'm doing and get it to you. Or you can say why and find out it's because that sales rep set that expectation with the customer. So then maybe you need to have a conversation after you review that contract to say, I don't want you to put yourself in a position to look bad with the customer. So maybe we need to change the way that conversation happens so that there's more realistic expectations and legal has an opportunity to do their job in a more thoughtful way, as opposed to having to rush through a review because you don't want to upset that prospect or that customer. The next slide. I guess I've already dialed this down to our highlights. The ignorance is bliss mentality as a potential pitfall, I think, is something that is a natural one, that sometimes there's just not enough time in the day to improve everything. Sometimes if it worked yesterday, it's going to have to work today is what we fall back on. But using that as a long-term strategy of if I don't see it, it doesn't happen, is going to lead to a lack of innovation and a lack of growth for the department and potentially for the business as well. That fear of not being needed anymore if we make a change also does the same thing in terms of hindering growth. If there's a culture of, I don't want to change because if I change my job, I might not be needed anymore, is going to force people to stick to the same way they've been doing things forever, as opposed to understanding that there's inherently value in that improvement. If you're seen as that person who saw an opportunity for growth, took it, managed through it, and moved ahead, then you're creating value for yourself, for your team. And that, again, goes back to that fear of failing, whether it's failing to feel needed or if I don't get this right, it's going to be terrible and something bad's going to happen. That erodes trust within the department. If you as a leader allow your team to fail gracefully and they know that failures are a required part of change, then that culture contribution goes a long way to just psychological safety, honestly. And people will be more open to try new things and to be a part of the change management effort, regardless of what it specifically is. And our success slide is next. I'm gonna make this short so that we have time for our next topic, but I think all of these practical applications are getting to the same point. Again, people are involved. So when it comes to your change management effort, being thoughtful, being considerate about whatever the change is, the choices that are made in order to make it successful, that should be your bottom line. People are going to be unpredictable at times. They can be unreliable. They're also your partners in change. So you're going to be destined to fail if you don't consider them. So like I said, being thoughtful will always get you further than not. And again, I won't get into these because I don't want to take up too much of Whitney's time, but be here for you on the recorded call and as well as a copy of the slides.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. I just wanted to quickly share our CLE slide before we get to Whitney's topic on AI. So this will be distributed in the materials, but for anyone who wants to write down that code now, it is SS8731. That's SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 8731. And again, this will be in the email with the slides that you will receive tomorrow. But I will now pass it to Whitney for her section on AI.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Andy. So we can just get to the next slide. We have limited time here, so I'm going to try to get through this and keep us on time. So essentially, I'm just going to kind of explain to you the business problem that we had. We had onboarded a new client, and they had thousands of single plaintiff litigations that were filed across the U.S., and they essentially wanted to split those evenly between keeping some in-house and then outsourcing to outside counsel, us being Seyfarth. And so for our piece in this, to manage the thousands or hundreds of single plaintiff litigations that we were going to handle for the client, we were going to have to assign a unique client matter number in order to ensure accurate tracking of each of these on our end. And with that, to get those numbers, there's a process, right? So the complaint document would come in, we would need to pull certain data points from that document and input that data into our system to then cycle it through so we could generate these client matter numbers for tracking purposes. And since there was a high volume of these coming in on a day-to-day basis, we actually had to hire 2 staff members on our team to really handle this data entry. So taking those data points from those complaints and then extracting them, putting them into our SharePoint system, and then generating the process of getting those client matter numbers. As you can imagine, this was a very labor-intense process, but it also posed a lot of risks and for inefficiencies and potential data management errors, as anything with humans do, right? So our solution here was that we developed an AI bot with our tech team. So, and what we did was take those 2 staff members to help us train this bot to be able to scan those complaint documents, pull those data points, insert that into our system. Our then team members would QC this, just a high-level QC, and then approve the information and push it through the system to get these client matter numbers. Next slide, please. So this was our overall just process, and there's a lot of change management, as you could imagine, in introducing this AI bot into our process. I don't want to go through all of the pitfalls and challenges, but just to highlight, I think one of the major things to keep in mind here is that we were going to obviously implement AI and kind of take over the human component that we hired these 2 staff members for. So I think one of the biggest things, right, is that, where does my job go? Now that we're going to implement this bot, what am I going to do? Kind of thing. So we had to really address that early on to ensure that those team members did not feel like we were trying to replace them, rather than enhance the process and then free them to do some more higher level tasks. So we really had to drive that home when we were actually implementing this. Another challenge that we had to make sure we addressed head on was we really had to demonstrate how this bot was going to improve our system, right? Like how it was going to cut down on time, costs, and how it was going to free up these resources to be able to dedicate their time to some more higher level tasks. So we really had to demonstrate that early on, and we had to get the buy-in of a lot of different stakeholders, some of them being the relationship partners who owned this account, the clients themselves, and then again, the 2 team members whose jobs were essentially going to change and shift. So we really had to be particular about our communication and bringing them in very early on to the process when we even thought through this solution. So that was really crucial in order to kind of avoid any of these pitfalls or challenges. Okay, next slide. I know we're getting close to time here. So just really quickly, how we were able to succeed. Some of the things that I already talked about in terms of the challenges that we were trying to head off is really how we succeeded. So we brought all of our stakeholders in first and foremost at the idea stage. Like, hey, we're thinking about introducing this bot that would be able to, have these type of benefits, cut down on time, cut down on cost, free up these resources, and here's how we're thinking it's going to lay out. and really being able to work with our tech team so that we could really talk through that with the partners, the client, and also our team members so that they could understand the real benefits here. And so once we got them engaged in that very early on, it was really easy from there for us to be able to work with our tech team and really get this bot integrated into our system. One of the things that we were sure to do as well was kind of map out what this is going to look like. And I said earlier, where if you want to like formalize those processes and really make it part of your organizational culture and part of that process, you really need to formalize it in some way. And so we had a group processing session where we produced a process map at the end and had all of the key players who were going to be a part of this process help us define exactly what the process would look like with the bot as part of that process. And so that was really, really helpful in terms of getting that buy-in and really having those stakeholders see early on how beneficial this was going to be. And then lastly, I'll say we were really sure to get feedback throughout this entire process. So it was really nice having the two team members work closely with our tech team so that they could help assist and have some ownership there and teaching the bot what exactly to pull from those complaint documents and then what to put in our system. So that was really, really beneficial. I know we're running out of time. We're 1 minute over, and I kind of had to zoom through that, which my apologies. But as we stated, you will get a copy of this deck afterwards. And if there's any questions that you have on my example or any of the examples that were presented by Ben or Rachel, we will be happy to address those after the fact. We can get in touch with you. So we really appreciate you all joining us today, and we really hope you benefited from this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much.